In the exclusive VIP lounge of the Royal Auction House, the air was thick, with the scent of mahogany and absolute privilege. It was 2026, an era where digital screens could scan almost anything, yet the human eye still held the final verdict on true history. A soft metallic click echoed faintly against the velvet-lined walls. To an ordinary person, it was just the sound of a lid closing. But to the man holding the linen cloth, it was the sound of a structural lie. A hairline fracture, no wider than a single strand of silk, sat on the rim of the 18th century royal silver platter. The item was scheduled for the live global auction in less than 2 hours, carrying a guaranteed reserve price of $2.5 million. A young man in a flawlessly pressed bespoke suit stepped into the light, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. This was Julian, the newly appointed chief director of antiquities, whose international degrees were framed in gold right behind his desk. He looked at the older man, holding the platter, his eyes narrowing with immediate disdain. Julian checked his luxury watch and sneered, asking why the cleaning was taking so long for a simple piece of metal. The older man did not look up immediately. His name was Arthur. Arthur was 55, with rough, calloused hands that bore the permanent gray stains of chemical solvents and polishing compound. His coat was faded at the elbows, and his movements were slow, almost painfully deliberate. Arthur suffered from severe dyslexia, a condition that made the dense text of Julian's authentication certificates look like a blur of meaningless black insects. But Arthur did not need to read the papers to read the silver. Arthur gently placed the platter down on the green felt pad, his voice calm, low, and entirely devoid of fear. He told Julian that this piece did not belong to the 18th century. Arthur pointed out that the outer silver plating was actively rejecting a chemical solvent beneath the surface, meaning it was a modern, electroplated counterfeit. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the silence of the VIP room. He walked over, snatched the platter from the pad, and looked at Arthur as if looking at a piece of dirt on his shoe. Julian told Arthur that he was just a high school dropout hired to wipe dust, while the machine scanners and 3 international boards had already signed the papers. He ordered Arthur to shut his mouth, finish the polish, and remember his place in this building. The chasm between them was absolute. On one side stood the elite director, backed by digital algorithms, and on the other, an old craftsman who could barely read a sentence, holding nothing but a lifetime of silent touch. Behind the neon-lit high recess of the financial district, Arthur's world shrunk to a small basement workshop buried in the old city quarter. The air here smelled of linseed oil, beeswax, and the cold, metallic scent of centuries-old copper. On his wooden workbench sat a collection of specialized loop lenses and heavy leather-bound photo reference books. Because of his severe dyslexia, Arthur could not read the academic texts on metallurgy, but his mind held a flawless visual library of every hammer mark and chemical patina ever recorded. He gently opened a small wooden drawer to retrieve a faded photograph of a young girl wearing a graduation cap. His daughter, Sarah, was currently completing her PhD in archaeology at the University of London. Her tuition for the final semester, along with her overdue rent notice, lay on the corner of the table, stamped with a crimson deadline. $4,500 was the price of her future, a sum Arthur's cleaning wage could never cover in time. The phone on the desk buzzed, displaying a video call from London. Sarah's face appeared, tired but filled with hope, as she told him her thesis defense was scheduled for next month. She asked if he was eating well and reminded him not to overwork his hands for her sake. Arthur smiled, his rough thumb tracing the glass screen over her face, telling her to focus entirely on her research, because everything at home was taken care of. He assured her that the silver and stone had never lied to him, and they wouldn't start now. The next morning, the heavy glass doors of the auction house closed behind Arthur as he was called into the main office. Julian was waiting, tossing a thick blue leather portfolio onto the table with an arrogant slap. The document was filled with dense English legal clauses and official stamps from international laboratory scans. Julian commanded Arthur to sign the final maintenance clearance immediately, stating the VIP client required a clean paper trail before the bidding opened. Arthur did not reach for the pen. Instead, he leaned over the table, his eyes locked onto the actual physical platter sitting in its velvet case. He stated calmly that if he signed the paper, he would be certifying a forgery. Julian chuckled darkly, leaning forward until he was inches away from Arthur's face. He whispered that a janitor who needs a text-to-speech app to read an email doesn't get an opinion on a multi-million-dollar masterpiece. Julian threatened that if Arthur refused to sign, his contract would be terminated immediately for insubordination, and the final bonus meant for his daughter's tuition would vanish. Arthur stood completely still in the center of the grand room, the weight of the pen in his hand, feeling heavier than all the silver in the vault. Julian's laughter faded into a cold, transactional silence as he closed the leather portfolio. He moved behind Arthur, his presence looming over the old man's shoulder, like an executioner weighing a final sentence. Julian whispered harshly into Arthur's ear, demanding he remember who paid for his daughter's expensive foreign dreams. He stated that the foundation funding Sarah's doctoral research was heavily tied to the board of directors at the Royal Auction House. One word from Julian about Arthur's sudden unreliability or cognitive decline would not just end Arthur's employment. It would pull the financial rug from beneath Sarah's feet before she could even enter the examination hall. Arthur's hand shook slightly, his fingers tightening around the worn strap of his tool bag. He looked at the digital scanner on the desk, knowing its internal software had been intentionally calibrated by Julian to bypass the chemical anomalies of electroplated modern silver. The chasm of absolute powerlessness threatened to swallow him whole. Later that afternoon, Arthur sat in the break room, his head buried in his rough palms. An old colleague, a senior janitor named Marcus, walked in and sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on Arthur's trembling shoulder. Marcus spoke softly, telling Arthur to just sign the paper and let the rich people cheat each other. Marcus argued that small folk like them couldn't fight the algorithms and the suits, especially when his daughter's future was on the line. Arthur looked up, his eyes dull with exhaustion, but his core remaining remarkably unyielding. He muttered that if he signed a lie, he would teach his daughter that a clean life could be bought with a dirty pen. He refused to pass down an inheritance of cowardice to the child who looked at his scarred hands with absolute pride. Instead of yielding, Sartor walked back into the main office and faced Julian once more. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he issue an empty threat. Arthur calmly proposed a practical test during the closed internal inspection in less than 1 hour. He stated that if he couldn't prove the silver platter was forged through a live physical demonstration, he would sign the document and resign without his severance pay. Julian's eyes gleamed with arrogant triumph as he agreed, seeing a perfect opportunity to legally eliminate the last remaining human obstacle to his multi-million-dollar scam. The air in the laboratory grew cold as the industrial ventilation system hummed quietly in the background. Julian stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his polished black leather shoes reflecting the harsh fluorescent overhead lighting. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against his arm, reminding Arthur that he had exactly 15 minutes before the board and the VIP client entered the room. Julian warned that if a single scratch appeared on the silver, the security guards waiting outside would ensure Arthur left the building in handcuffs. Arthur did not answer. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to slow down as he reached into his worn canvas tool bag. He did not touch the digital laser scanners sitting on the steel table, knowing they had been calibrated to look only at the surface level. Instead, Arthur pulled out a small, tarnished brass oil lamp and a simple glass jar containing a clear, odorless liquid he had mixed himself from common laboratory salts. His rough fingers, cracked and stained from decades of manual labor, suddenly became incredibly steady as he touched the artifact. He lit the small wick of the lamp, producing a tiny, focused blue flame that danced in the sterile environment. Arthur slowly passed the underside of the silver platter over the heat, keeping it exactly 3 inches above the flame. Julian sneered, calling the method primitive witchcraft and mocking the old man for trying to use centuries-old tricks against modern technology. But Arthur remained entirely focused, his eyes tracking the micro-movements of the metal as the temperature reached exactly 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Suddenly, a faint, metallic click echoed through the room. It was not the sound of breaking metal, but the sound of structural contraction. Arthur quickly took a cotton swab, dipped it into the neutral salt solution, and wiped it across the heated base of the platter. Under the chemical reaction, the shiny silver surface began to turn a dull, chalky white, revealing a hidden seam running along the interior rim. Julian's sneer vanished instantly, his face turning pale as he stepped closer to the table. Beneath the dissolving modern coating, a faint, crudely engraved mark began to appear under the lamplight. It was not the royal crest of the 18th century Vung Trio, but a modern manufacturing registration code from a liquidation warehouse in Eastern Europe. The heavy security guards stepped forward, their shadows crossing over the metal table as Julian raised his hand to stop the demonstration. Julian ordered the guards to seize the old man's tools and escort him out of the premises immediately for malicious property damage. He snatched the altered silver platter, turning it over so the white residue faced away from the door, hiding the modern chemical registration mark from sight. Julian sneered, whispering that nobody outside this room would ever believe a janitor who couldn't even read the employee handbook. Arthur did not resist, nor did he raise his voice to argue with the guards as they pulled him toward the back exit. He kept his expression perfectly calm, but his mind was racing as he realized Julian had already falsified the digital audit trail to erase this entire test. As Arthur stepped into the rainy alleyway behind the auction house, his old mobile phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. It was an urgent call from London, and Sarah's voice broke through the speaker, filled with sudden panic and tears. She told him that the University Review Board had just flagged her primary archaeological thesis for suspected historical plagiarism. A major academic paper had just been uploaded online, claiming the exact same discovery about the Royal Vung Trio silver artifacts. The author listed on that fraudulent paper was none other than Julian, using the auction house's elite credentials to steal her research. If the auctions house successfully sold the counterfeit silver platter today, using Julian's stolen research as proof, Sarah's academic career would be permanently destroyed. Arthur stood under the freezing rain, realizing the trap was far bigger than a single forged piece of metal. His daughter's lifelong dream was about to be sacrificed to cement a corporate lie, and he was completely isolated from the world. He looked down at his rough, chemical-stained hands, knowing he had no legal authority, no money, and no academic voice. But as he wiped the rain from his face, his eyes turned cold and focused, fixed on a specific detail he had left behind in the room. Before the guards had grabbed him, Arthur had intentionally left his dirty cleaning rag directly on the lid of Julian's customized chemical case. A tiny drop of the neutral salt solution had dripped onto the expensive leather sleeve of Julian's suit jacket during the struggle. Arthur slowly picked up his worn canvas tool bag from the ground, checked his watch, and walked back toward the main entrance. He whispered into the phone, telling Sarah to print her original time-stamped research logs and prepare to join a live video broadcast in exactly 30 minutes. The grand auditorium of the Royal Auction House was filled to capacity, with high-profile collectors and international art investors whispering under the dim, ambient lighting. On the main stage, the silver platter sat under a sharp, targeted spotlight, its polished surface reflecting millions of dollars of false prestige. Julian stood confidently behind the podium, his hand hovering over the mahogany gavel as he announced the final call for the $3 million bid from the international oil tycoon. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium slammed open, cutting through the synchronized applause of the elite crowd. It was not an act of chaotic disruption, but the formal entrance of the Independent Heritage Audit Board, accompanied by 2 federal regulatory officers. Walking alongside them was Sarah, holding a thick stack of time-stamped laboratory logs, while her university dean appeared on the grand projection screen via a live digital stream from London. Julian's face tightened for a split second, but he quickly recovered his arrogant composure, laughing into the microphone and asking if a disgraced former janitor and a student had come to audit a legal auction. The lead auditor did not engage in the argument. Instead, he stepped up to the stage and drew a high-powered, multi-spectrum ultraviolet inspection light from his case. Arthur stepped into the light from the wings of the stage, his voice calm and clear, as he instructed the technician to shut down the main overhead display lamps. The room plunged into absolute darkness, save for the intense purple glow of the auditor's handheld UV light scanning the stage. Instantly, the entire audience gasped as bright, neon green luminescent stains flared to life across the sleeve of Julian's expensive designer suit and the handle of the silver platter's display case. Arthur explained to the crowd that the chemical compound used to artificially age modern silver alloys reacts instantly to neutral salt solutions, leaving an invisible residue that glows under specific ultraviolet wavelengths for 48 hours. The very chemical case Julian had locked away hours ago had transferred the proof directly onto his hands and clothing during his attempt to hide the forgery. The digital scanners Julian had tampered with could be bypassed, but the simple physical law of chemical transfer could not be rewritten. The heavy ultraviolet light remained fixed on the stage, casting a surreal violet glow over the frozen crowd. Julian's fingers opened in a slow, involuntary spasm, and the mahogany gavel slipped from his hand, clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. He stared down at the glowing neon green marks on his own tailored sleeves, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. The international oil tycoon slowly pulled his beating paddle down, his dark eyes turning into twin ice blocks as he looked from Julian to the defaced silver platter. The tycoon spoke with a low, dangerous growl, asking if the Royal Auction House truly believed they could sell a modern warehouse replica to a family that had collected Vung Trio antiquities for 3 generations. Julian stumbled backward against the podium, his voice cracking high as he desperately pointed at Arthur, screaming that this was a setup and that a illiterate maintenance worker had contaminated the evidence to extort the company. But the lead auditor stepped directly between them, holding a portable molecular mass spectrometer that was already printing out the atmospheric data. The auditor announced to the room that the chemical composition detected on Julian's clothing was 99% identical to the industrial silver aging solution banned by maritime law in 2024. He looked at Arthur, his expression shifting from formal distance to absolute, uncharacteristic respect. The auditor stated that Arthur's manual heat test had perfectly triggered the outgassing of the modern synthetic backing, something no automated surface scanner was programmed to search for. Sarah stepped forward on the projection screen from London, her voice steady and clear as she presented the digital time-stamped registries of her original metal decay research. She stated that the exact chemical blueprint used to create this counterfeit was stolen from her private university account less than 72 hours ago via an IP address registered directly to Julian's office desk. The wealthy investors in the front rows began to stand up, turning their backs to the stage in a synchronized wave of disgust. Julian sank into his chair, the weight of his fraud pressing down on his chest as he realized that Arthur's quiet, deliberate movements had documented every single step of his crime, without writing a single line of text. The old craftsman stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, his faded coat creating a stark contrast against the brilliant, useless luxury of the grand hall. The heavy silence in the grand hall was broken only by the sound of whispering security guards, moving to surround the stage. The board of directors of the Royal Auction House acted swiftly to save what little remained of their international reputation. The senior chairman stepped forward, his voice amplification system carrying a cold, decisive statement across the room. He announced the immediate and permanent cancellation of the auction lot, stripping Julian of all executive titles and authority, effective immediately. 2 federal regulatory officers moved in, placing Julian under formal custody as they prepared to transfer his files to the International Fraud Division. Julian looked down at his trembling, glowing hands, realizing his elite career had ended in the very room where he sought absolute power. The chairman then turned to face Arthur, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional apology. He publicly recognized the systemic failure of their automated screening methods and the blindness of their corporate arrogance. In front of the entire assembly of global collectors, the chairman formally offered Arthur the position of Chief Valuation Advisor for their Global Heritage Preservation Wing. A brand new, premium bespoke suit was brought out by the staff, offered alongside a contract that carried a guaranteed 6-figure signing bonus. On the projection screen, Sarah burst into tears of absolute relief and pride, her voice echoing softly from London. Her academic dean confirmed that her original thesis logs had been fully verified, vindicating her research completely. The university had awarded her a full doctoral scholarship, celebrating her breakthrough discovery regarding modern plating counterfeits. Arthur looked at the screen, a quiet, gentle smile finally softening the deep lines on his tired face. He looked at the expensive suit and the luxury fountain pen offered by the board, then slowly shook his head. Arthur politely declined the executive position and the wealth that came with it, stating his hands were meant for the workbench, not the boardroom. He picked up his worn canvas tool bag, slung it over his shoulder, and adjusted his faded jacket. Without waiting for the cameras or the applause, the old craftsman turned away from the spotlight and walked out into the cool evening air. The cold rain outside had finally stopped, leaving the cobblestone streets of the old quarter glistening under the soft amber glow of the gas lamps. Arthur walked slowly down the narrow steps leading into his basement workshop, the heavy iron key turning smoothly in the ancient brass lock. He placed his canvas tool bag on the scarred wooden workbench and sat down, leaning his head back against the brick wall as the quiet hum of the room enveloped him. The silence here was not lonely. It was the peaceful stillness of an honest life, completely untouched by the hollow glamour of the auction stage. Arthur pulled a clean piece of drafting paper toward him, along with a thick charcoal pencil that felt warm and familiar between his rough, calloused fingers. Because his dyslexia prevented him from writing long, flowing sentences, he slowly began to sketch a series of simple, precise diagrams detailing the microporosity of electroplated silver alloys. He opened a text-to-speech mobile application on his desk and spoke into the microphone, his voice deep, calm, and filled with a quiet weight. Arthur dictated a message to Sarah, telling her that the tools had been cleaned, the workbench was set, and the truth had found its proper balance. He told her that people will always try to weigh a man's worth by the speed of his speech or the shine of his clothes, but history is only recorded by the precision of his actions. On the desk, the phone screen lit up with a final message from London, showing a photograph of Sarah, standing proudly in front of the university library, her eyes bright with the exact same unyielding determination that defined her father. Arthur smiled, turning off the desk lamp and letting the darkness settle over the room, leaving only the faint scent of beeswax and cold metal. The silver platter had been polished, the lie had been exposed, and the legacy of the craftsman remained entirely unblemished. If you ever find yourself looking at something that glitters too brightly under the spotlight, remember to look past the surface and search for the hidden seam. Because a reputation can be bought with $1 million, but honor is forged only through the quiet, unbending choices we make when nobody else is watching. What matters more to you when the world demands a compromise? The security of a comfortable lie or the heavy weight of an unspoken truth?